Greetings, Internet, and welcome to G-Score, the podcast, a symphonic history of the Godzilla series.
Hi, Evan.
Hey, Jonathan.
And greetings, Internet. Welcome to G-Score the podcast. This is part 2 of episode 3. Now, for those who are faithful listeners, we last left you all off on discussing the Japanese version of King Kong vs. Godzilla, which, for those who have seen both the American and the Japanese version of this film, know how different they really are to each other. So much so that we decided on behalf of ourselves to split this movie score discussion into a two-parter. See how considerate we are with you guys? We think about our fans.
Yeah, on behalf of ourselves, not even on behalf of the fans. We did this just for us.
Exactly. So we also left out a juicy portion of this discussion involving the famous stop-motion animator Willis O'Brian and certain events that led to some drama and to his unfortunate passing in 1962. Now, with the last episode, we wanted to focus more on the Japanese aspects of this film in its purest form. Many of you will be more familiar with this Americanized version that we're going to be discussing, since for many years, the original Japanese version wasn't available pretty much anywhere until more recently. In this episode, we'll be discussing the nostalgic yet debauched and domesticated version of this film that was released in the US. While I still think this is a good movie in many regards, I would unfortunately say it was stripped of many of the aspects that made it unique, especially Akira Ifukube's score. Don't you agree?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, Jonathan, I remember that you and I recently watched the movie together, and when we did, the Japanese version that is, and when we did, it was actually your first time watching the original cut of King Kong vs. Godzilla. I had seen it several years ago because I have various dubious sources. But
sounds illegal.
You know what? Let's call it the gray market, shall we? So,
very well.
In any case, you and I were able to enjoy it over Zoom, and so I actually I'd like to get your opinion now. You have gone up until earlier this year, your entire life, only familiar with the American version of King Kong vs. Godzilla, which, as far as I can figure, you enjoyed it for what it was, and it was a fun movie, and it has good childhood memories for you. What was your reaction, since it's much more fresh in your memory than mine? What was your initial reaction or impression when you were watching the original cut as you were watching it? What was your big takeaway?
Well, first I was shocked. First of all, it really boggled me how different in many regards it was. For one instance, I mean, obviously the musical score was vastly different. The only portion that survived of Akira Ifukube's score was the native island chant. On top of that, you had many scenes of character development which were unfortunately just stripped out, and many parts of dialogue that was made for further development in all these characters. And on top of that, I didn't realize how much of a satire it was on commercialism of Japan and the TV industry at that time. So all of this was just really overwhelming for me, though it was such a fresh and unique sensation just watching all this in a different way, since I was so used to the Americanized versions for so many years, as many of us and many who are listening have been for the longest time, ever since they were kids. And it's very much in line with what happened to maybe a few Godzilla films for many years, though I would say that this version is probably the most altered of all the Godzilla films that I can recall.
I think I don't know if I would say that this is the That's a good point, because I was going to just say, well, did you forget about Gojira and King of the Monsters and with Raymond Burr? But at least they maintained Ifukube's score, and they mostly kept the ambiance of the original film. They just inserted an American actor into that. Yeah, no, you might be right to some degree. Yeah, yeah. Depending on how you want to count your ducks, that you might be right about that. So when you were watching this movie, did you feel like, because this movie definitely has a different ambiance than the American version. The American version takes itself too seriously, even though the American version is very tongue in cheek. It does present the drama as too straightforward. The Japanese version is much more satirical. It's much more self-aware. It's much more meta, and I think that that's to its benefit because it's inherently a goofy premise to begin with. It knows it and it relishes in it, and the American version tries to play it up as a straight monster movie. When you were watching the film, did you feel like you were just watching the same movie, King Kong versus Godzilla, but with a different personality or a different atmosphere about itself, or did you feel like you were watching a brand new movie altogether? What was your personal reaction?
Hmm. Well, it was a little bit of everything of what you mentioned. It's not to say that the American version didn't have its goofy or silly moments too.
But were they really
However,
intentional?
yeah, I think that's the difference right there because at least with the Japanese version, it knew what it was. And so it kind of ran with it in full colors. With the Americanized version, it definitely was more of a straightforward, typical monster flick of the time, though that was intentional on behalf of John Beck's part. And since we're going to be discussing about John Beck, why don't you mention some of the behind the scenes that happened with Willis O'Brien and John Beck during this production of the movie?
Yeah, sure. So, it's funny when you think about King Kong versus Godzilla, we just think of it as a Toho production. And rightly so, it is a Toho production. They're the ones that funded this movie entirely. They did sell the rights to John Beck, who in turn sold it to Universal International for distribution. But it was a purely Japanese made film, albeit with the inclusion of a very distinctively American ape in it. So, how do you get such a famous American ape across the Pacific Ocean? Well, you may remember that there's this little known guy named Willis O'Brian. He was, in many respects, the godfather of stop motion animation, especially pioneering the special effect as a profession, as a high art form in Hollywood. His work goes all the way back to the 1900s and 19 teens. I remember vividly watching as a kid his silent film, the 1925 movie The Lost World.
Classic.
Oh, it's wonderful. And his dinosaurs, though not exactly anatomically correct by today's scientific standards, were just beautifully executed. They all had wonderful personality, even when the Allosaurus snarls and its lips roll around. It seems a little silly, or when the Brontosaurus does the same thing. From our perspective today, it seems kind of funny, but the effects are wonderful. And then, less than a decade later, he churns out King Kong, and that movie took the special effects and just cranked it up to an 11.
Oh, completely blew it out of the water.
Oh, it's phenomenal. If you ever have an opportunity to get the 1933 film on Blu-ray or DVD and watch the behind-the-scenes making of it, it was so involved. I have enormous appreciation for the art of stop-motion animation. I dabbled in it extensively in my youth, making my own short films with clay figures. I actually tried creating armature Godzillas out of wireframes and so on. And I love the entire art of stop motion animation. It's incredible.
Right.
And
And
you,
I think someone like Willis O'Brien, with all the work that he's done and how much of an influence he was, he didn't really get the credit that he deserved, especially in his later years.
yeah, I would say that perhaps in his later years he wasn't appreciated as much. And during his lifetime, I mean, nowadays people do look back on him as being one of the great masters of special effects in Hollywood history, as we fondly remember people like Ray Harryhausen or Stan Winston. But yeah, Hollywood was not kind. They didn't have great respect for the man, as we're going to find out. But because stop motion animation is such an incredibly involved, tedious, time consuming, and very difficult art to perform. And he did it all himself, as far as I'm aware. He didn't think highly of the Japanese alternative of suitmation. He thought it was cheap. He thought it was hokey. He thought it was not nearly as polished or realistic. Now, personally, Obi, I love you to death. And I will fight on the side of stop motion animation till I'm blue in the face. But I have to disagree with you here, because in my personal opinion, if you do suitmation justice, as we've seen, for example, in the original Gojira, or say in the Heisei Gamera trilogy of the 1990s, it can be, I think, even the superior form of bringing a monster to life. I think that suitmation has an ability to create a kinetic energy and have a visceral presence on film itself. Sure, models will always be models, and costumes will always be costumes, but 18-inch armature puppets are going to still be 18-inch armature puppets. Unless you're, building a life-size T-Rex a la Stan Winston for Jurassic Park, you're almost always going to have some measure of suspension of disbelief that you need to let go of in order to accept the fantasy that's being given to you. And I think that any measure of suspension of disbelief that is owed to stop motion is owed just as much to suitmation. I don't think that one is necessarily better than the other. I do have a preference for suitmation. If I were going to get into special effects, that would be the direction I would personally want to go in. I don't think that objectively one is necessarily better than the other. They're two sides of the same coin almost. Anyways, the reason I went on that rant, Willis O'Brian didn't think highly of suitmation, which is going to be important for how things turned out at the end of this story. So Obi, as his fans, such as myself, affectionately call him, because we're on a first name basis, call me Obi, kisses.
Sure.
He wanted to pursue a kind of passion project of his, and he had a lot of passion projects that he had either had a very hard time getting off the ground or was never actually able to get off the ground. Like, there was one that he wrote called The Valley of Guanji, which is a childhood favorite of mine, and that was never made in his lifetime. Several years after he passed, his protege Ray Harryhausen actually made the film in the 1960s, and that's about cowboys out west wrangling prehistoric dinosaurs, because why not?
What else could you ask for?
Well, aliens, maybe.
Oh, we've had that.
O'Brian had the idea of having King Kong fight Frankenstein's monster. But don't go thinking Boris Karloff Frankenstein with the volts in the neck. He wanted to have it be a conglomeration of African animals being sewn together, created in a laboratory in Africa that breaks out and ends up fighting with King Kong in was it San Francisco or LA or something? San Francisco,
yeah.
I think.
Yeah, well, that's pretty original.
Obi had this project he wanted to do, and he was shopping around all over Hollywood, and nobody was really taking it seriously. So he ended up showing his storyboards of King Kong versus Frankenstein to Daniel O'Shea, an attorney at RKO Pictures. And RKO is the film company that produced the original King Kong, hoping to obtain rights to use Kong in a film. So even though O'Brian is the special effects master that brought Kong to life, he didn't own King Kong as a property. O'Shea liked the idea that Brian had, so he introduced him to a producer named John Beck. His only really remarkable movie that he produced that anybody today would remember would be the James Stewart film Harvey. But John Beck then more or less told O'Brian, I'm going to go shop it around. You just hang tight. Don't call me. I'll call you. But Obi did call him. He called him a lot. Regularly, he would ring the office, and O'Brian would just keep saying, we haven't heard anything yet. Don't worry. I'll let you know as soon as something comes up. Well, what John Beck didn't tell O'Brian is that he had been shopping it around everywhere in the States, and nobody wanted it. And then he decided to take it overseas to Toho. And it just so happens that Toho was wanting to make another big feature for their 30th anniversary, and they wanted to bring Godzilla back.
No, I could just see Toho just twiddling their fingers saying, excellent.
Yeah, no, really. It's like Toho's like, okay, we want to bring back Godzilla. We want to do a special for the 30th anniversary, but we've got no ideas.
What should we do?
What should we do? How will we make this work? Ding dong. Who's that? Hey, I've got King Kong. Come on in. It was like a match made in heaven for Toho. John Beck did this without permission from O'Brian. O'Brian would never have agreed to allowing it to go to Toho because Toho only did Suitmation. Toho did not have the money or the resources or the time to do professional stop motion animation like O'Brian. And
he would have had a heart attack.
And in fact, he did. More on that later.
Oh, goodness.
Spoilers. And so, and to make matters worse, Toho said, we like this idea of King Kong versus Frankenstein, which at the time John Beck had retitled King Kong versus Prometheus. Prometheus being a allusion to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein story. And Toho's like, that's great. Just get rid of the Frankenstein creature and let us put Godzilla in instead, and we've got ourselves a movie. And John Beck said, okay. And that's what happened. From Toho's side of things, you know how it goes because you listened to part 1 of episode 3. Or at least you better have. Go back and listen if you didn't.
So now at this point, with Kong in their hands, Toho decided, we're going to make this movie. They made it. It became a huge success in Japan. And so after that huge success, what happened to that sly coon known as John Beck? Well, once this happened and John Beck sold the rights to Toho, they made their movie. Now it was America's turn. Now it's time to finally have the Americanized version, this dubbed version of this film. And so, thankfully, or unthankfully, depending how you see it, Beck decided to use a laundry list of different themes and music from a library of other movies, thanks to Universal Pictures International, which allowed this. Though, as he saw the movie, he had a private screening of the film, and he didn't like it. At least not the comedic aspects of the film, since, as we mentioned previously, the original Japanese version was a satire of commercialism at that time. So he started to work on his own version and tried to turn it into a straight monster sci-fi flick, which it unfortunately did become. And I say unfortunately because that's what stripped it of its uniqueness. It became more of another monster movie, and it's funny because it still had its goofy, funny moments, but it's like you said, Evan, at least with the Japanese version, it was more intentional. There was purpose to it.
It was more self-aware.
Exactly. With this version, it was a bit just more ridiculous, and it wasn't as self-aware. It was a bit more obvious in that. Though at least they did have the character of Mr. Taco, who is still a hoot with his manic expressions and digging his fingers through his hair, just tired of seeing so much publicity about Godzilla and wanted his own monster. So in doing these changes, not only did it result in a quote-unquote serious film, which was what Beck was after, supposedly, though it did unfortunately have kind of a more mixed bag because of that. Even as a kid, I thought every time that Fujiyuki's character talked about his corns hurting was the funniest thing ever, because I thought there were literal vegetables on his feet or something that were hurting him, because I didn't understand at that time.
So for the audience, since we might have a lot of younger folk listening in to our podcast, why don't you explain to them what exactly corns are?
Well, sadly, they are not vegetables on your feet. It's more of a callus that just happens to be on your feet. And I guessed with Fujiyuki's character, they were just hurting him every time he sensed the presence of a monster nearby. So
he's got foot sores. That's all it was.
Yeah. So he had this strange connection with monsters and corns for some reason. He was almost like the Mickey Sagusa of that time, but except with corns. While cutting out so many of these other comedic moments in the Japanese version, Beck, I should say, also removed much of the Japanese dialogue and the character development And it's a real shame because cutting out character development is like stealing the soul of a character. It's like taking out the engine of a car. It's what makes the character unique. And unfortunately, that was stripped of it. And so, what did Beck replace with those important moments of the film with? Blasphemy, that's what. No. In all seriousness, what he did replace it with was with footage of newly shot scenes of a character named Eric Carter, who was a UN reporter who spends most of the time on screen commentating on the action from a UN communication satellite broadcast, as well as Arnold Johnson, the head of the Museum of Natural History in New York, who is pretty much just explaining and recapping to the audience the origin of Godzilla and Kong's motivations. Now, these scenes are just so biased. I mean, and they're pretty much downplaying Godzilla, especially comparing Kong's brain to Godzilla's. You see, have hit the skull of Kong, and then
Now,
they just
Godzilla has
compare
a brain
Godzilla's...
about the size of this marble, whereas Kong is a thinking animal. It's like, oh, please.
Exactly.
These animals are
Yes.
so much larger than that. It's like, whatever. I don't know where you got your
Yes.
cheap ape skull from. No, and you're right.
Exactly.
Essentially, what John Beck wanted to do here was the same thing that was pulled off with the original Gojira. We didn't talk much about it because we're saving that for a lot of backstory for part 2 of episode 16. But the short of it is, when the 1954 Godzilla film came to the States and it got into the hands of American producers, they cut out a ton of the film. They removed a lot of its serious anti-American, anti-nuclear allegories and subtext, and they inserted actor Raymond Burr, about half an hour's worth of footage, and actually physically put him into the movie to make him a part of the story, to make him interact with the characters, to make him involved in the action as it went along. John Beck wanted to do something similar, but he did not have the time nor the money by a long shot to do any of that stuff. So what he ended up doing was going to 2 writers by the name of Paul Manson and Bruce Howard. And Manson and Howard were partners in crime at this time, and both were in serious need of work. And so John Beck offered them to do it. So years later, in a 1996 interview, Bruce Howard recounted the story, saying,
"One day, Paul came to me and he said, I got an assignment, but he seemed reluctant to tell me about it. He had been introduced to the producer John Beck by a friend who knew he needed work. So he told me, they've got this King Kong vs. Godzilla. It's made in Japan and they want to put an American story to it. I said, hey, great, it sounds like fun. But he wanted to do it himself because it didn't pay that much. He told me, it only pays $3,500 for 5 weeks' work. And I said, hey, we're partners. You have to let me in on it.
So once you've got the script for this alternate take on King Kong vs. Godzilla, how do you actually make it happen? With a darn good editor, that's how. So John Beck hired Peter Zinner, who at the time was just now doing work independently, but he would later go on to edit such great films as In Cold Blood, The Godfather, and The Deer Hunter, for which he won an Oscar. So Zinner recounted also in 1996. There were a lot of interviews in 1996. I don't think that's coincidence. Zinner also recounted later on in an interview, quote,
John Beck knew of my company's existence, and one day he gave me a call. He had a deal with Universal, but he still had to Americanize the film and put it into English. And then he would sell it, I later found out, to Universal for $200,000, which was a lot of money in those days. We got very little, about $12,000 to do everything, which was ridiculous. We recut it. We added the music, which was a compilation of things from several different composers, things in the public domain. They didn't like the original music. They felt it should be sort of westernized, and that's what I was told to do. I supervised the dubbing and lip-syncing as well. John Beck gave me carte blanche. He trusted me, and of course, he okayed everything I did in the end. Then he sent it to Universal, and they bought it. As I remember, I didn't come out too bad. It was sort of tongue-in-cheek. It did very good business, and I was very thankful to work on it because it came at a time in my career when I had just set out on my own.
So yeah, there you have it. He said that he didn't like the music and he felt it needed to be more Western sounding.
That makes me dislike him even more for saying such heinous things. But regardless, it is what it is. So now, talking about music, why don't we actually discuss the meat of this podcast, the score itself? Now, while these scores might not be on par with the original, I will say it does use some cues that are going to be very familiar and very interesting for any monster movie fans out there. Beck was able to secure a deal with Universal Pictures, as we mentioned before, during this time since they were the distributor, and chose from the library music a few cues from people such as Henry Mancini, Hans J. Salter, from different films like The Golden Horde, Thunder on the Hill, and of course, the infamous Creature from the Black Lagoon. Now, for the first portion of this score, obviously the main theme of King Kong vs. Godzilla is sadly taken out. For this first part of the score, we have the main theme of The Golden Horde, a theme that replaces the native chant. Though the native chant is still present in the movie of Faroe Island, which is one of the few surviving pieces of Ifukube's work, it's barely there, it's barely present, it's just kind of for a little portion of the film, and then it's gone. Though this main theme is thunderous, it's not in the same way that the original theme was. And funny enough, one of John Beck's complaints of the score was that supposedly it was too oriental sounding, which is funny because this theme is rather oriental sounding because it came from the movie The Golden Horde, which takes place in Mongolia dealing with the conqueror Genghis Khan. So
yeah, it almost sounds, it does sound stereotypically oriental. It sounds very chopsticky, and they even put like Chinese restaurant font on the opening text crawl, and it's like, didn't you want this to be passed off as like a co-production between East and West, and yet you're making it seem even more Asian than it did when it was just an Asian film. But I hate to say it, but it's like the text and the hokey Asian music, it almost seems a little racist.
That is so true. I did not notice about that. The text. You are absolutely right about that. That makes it even more hilarious. Yeah, so we have a non-oriental theme for the intro of this movie. Also, another battle theme, well, it's used as a battle theme, is the fight between Kong and the giant octopus. And in this scene, it is replaced by the leitmotif of Creature from the Black Lagoon. Now, I personally do love this score with its blaring horns. It's a dead giveaway to it for anyone who's familiar with that movie.
By the famed composer Henry Mancini, by the way.
Yes, yes. And even as a kid, I loved Creature from the Black Lagoon. And I do love the track for what it was originally intended for. At the same time, I personally like to have things to have their own identity. Something that was stripped, obviously, from King Kong vs. Godzilla, the original version. Though this theme is dark, it's brooding, and it's accompanied by the infamous three-note blaring motif that is prominent in the rest of the movie and other scenes. But I will say in some respects it is appropriate. Like, it is appropriate for the scene that might be happening. It's just, when I hear that theme, I think of Creature from the Black Lagoon. But I wasn't offended by it. I just was more offended by them stripping Fukube out of it. Also, another monster flick that was used in this score was a track called Patrol from The Monster That Challenged the World. And it was used when Godzilla was approaching a train where Fujita's girlfriend is mindlessly running away in her high heels. What I do like about this score in particular is the ominous piano that indicates Godzilla is coming closer, with trumpets heightening the suspense.
The ones that stood out to me are actually much the same as for yourself. One track that I like that also takes place during the train sequence, and unfortunately I do not know the name of the track itself or its original source material. I do know that it had been used in Western TV shows during the 1950s and 1960s. And it's and it's kind of funny hearing what is very clearly a stereotypical Western musical motif or a stylized representation of American Indians, the kind of foot pounding tribal dance with the dun 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 dun. It almost sounds like it's very out of place. It's like here you see Godzilla coming up on a train in the middle of a forest, and you feel like you should have some Native Americans on horseback chasing after you. But then it goes into this really nice trilling string section, very frantic, and it has a nice energy to it. It has a nice pace. It's a fine piece of music on its own. And this music is stuff that was written for B films in America. This is music that was largely in the public domain. It was stock music from a library at Universal Studios. Even back then, throwaway B movies had great music. There are a couple of other pieces that are very nostalgic for me, and I thought that, I mean, yes, it's a shame that they removed Ifukube's music, but I gotta give credit where credit is due. And Peter Zener, you did a wonderful job with the music editing in this regard. That King Kong is such a goofy, dopey monster, and he looks it. He just looks ridiculous, and he looks a little stupid. He kind of reminds me of, like, you know, an overweight, middle class, blue collar father in a sitcom who can't be bothered to get out of his lazy boy and is always tripping over stuff. The music really plays into that persona that you perceive King Kong has. Ifukube gave King Kong a majesty and a ferocity, and the Americans made Kong seem like a real dope. And one piece
which is funny because that's their monster. So
yeah. One piece of music I like, which is called "The Long Journey Home" in the American soundtrack, is actually comprised of part Mancini's Black Lagoon score and part Selter's score for Wichita Town. And that track in particular is called "The Empty House." And that track which plays when King Kong is rendered unconscious by Godzilla, because King Kong tries to pull off a judo flip, misses, hits his head up against a rock, rolls over, and is going in and out of consciousness, and Godzilla decides to help him right into unconsciousness by smacking him with his tail and kicking giant boulders into his face. Then as Kong is just lays there totally unconscious, dazed, his head kind of moving around, and Godzilla leans over, slowly opening and closing his mouth, examining Kong, seeing whether or not he's actually dead. It's got a very cartoon quality to it, but it works. It really does. It's humorous. It almost plays to the anthropomorphized characters that are the monsters at this point. Ifukube always plays the monsters straight from a musical perspective. It doesn't matter how ridiculous the monsters might be on screen, Ifukube always underscores a more serious, straightforward score. And the American version doesn't. The American version is like, these monsters are silly and they're behaving silly, so let's play into that with the music. And I think it actually works. Case in point, there was another piece composed by Hans Selter for the short-lived TV show Wichita Town again. This piece being the track Town Deserted, or in the Godzilla film, Kong Advances on Mount Fuji. And in particular, you can hear this music as Kong is running away from Godzilla, because he remembers Godzilla from the previous battle. He got himself toasted, and so he scurries up Mount Fuji, walks through a couple of houses, a very nice effect, by the way, and then hides himself underneath a giant boulder. And as Godzilla walks past, and he's hoping Godzilla doesn't see him, and then eventually he decides to be brave and grab Godzilla by the tail and re-engage him. But the whole personality of Kong being coy and cowardly, and again being a bit of a doofus, it works so well with this music. And then when Kong goes into attack mode, the creature from the Black Lagoon motif reappears, which I think the creature theme is used both for Godzilla and Kong throughout the movie, but for some reason in my head I associated more with Kong than Godzilla. I think it's probably used in more of Kong's scenes than Godzilla's, but don't quote me on that. It's been forever since I've seen the American version.
Right. I think, yeah, mostly when they're together, they tend to use that score. In the case of their first encounter with Kong and Godzilla, there's a cue called Catch 'Em, The Fight by Herschel Burke Gilbert. And this was composed for Fritz Lang's While the City Sleeps, which was in 1956. This theme has appeared in various films and TV programs, even such as films or rather shows like The Rifleman, actually. And I think it's funny, especially for their first encounter, they use this theme because it is very Western. It reminds me of a showdown in the West of the deputy confronts the outlaw, who will draw first. And I will say with this score, the more I realize it, yes, Ifukube's score was more serious. Although I will say, since the movie is a bit more comedic, in some ways it does fit somehow. Zinger made it work in this case. But I still yearn for Ifukube's score. But for what was done, I do think they did a fairly decent job in it.
Yeah, I think that Ifukube objectively has the much better music, and his original score is far more memorable and noteworthy. However, for me personally, the American version of King Kong vs. Godzilla is very nostalgic.
Absolutely.
This is the first Godzilla movie I ever owned, along with Godzilla Raids Again. And this and Raids Again would be the first Godzilla movies I've ever seen in their entirety. Of course, both of which were the American version, plus Godzilla vs. Megalon, thanks to its endless reruns on television. And so those three movies made up my first introduction to Godzilla. And so I've been hearing the stock music for King Kong vs. Godzilla US version for over 30 years now. So I can't help but have a love and get like this warm fuzzy feeling and this smile on my face when I hear it, because of all the memories and all of the emotions it conjures up. And it really does placate to the silliness of this movie pretty well. It's just a shame that the rest of the movie was trying to take itself more seriously than it should have, because I think that if you no offense to Fukube, if you kept the comical Japanese satirical element, but also played into the hokiness of the monster's antics with music to boot, as the American version did in some areas, I think you would have gotten a winning formula. But, overall, of course, I would absolutely settle for the Japanese version over this. I don't know if I would change it if I could, because it's so charming in its own bizarre and demented sort of way. And honestly, the only reason we have the Faroe Island chant retained in the American version of this film is because Universal did not have any Islander chant music that Zener could use instead of Ifukube. So they left it in because there was literally no equivalent in their stock library that would work just as well.
Oh, good for us then. We at least got to hear that original part of the score.
Yeah, I mean, it also helps that you see a lot of Islanders dance in beat with the Ifukube music, and so even if you found Islander music that could theoretically work, is it going to be at the same tempo and move in the same beat with the choreography of the dance moves? So it's best just to keep it as is.
Yeah, absolutely.
I said that Ifukube's score is more memorable, but this is more nostalgic. To that point, though the score speaks deeply to my childhood, I will say this. The one thing from the American version that stood out to me as a kid more than any other, head and shoulders above all of the rest, was Ifukube's island music. It only appears maybe 2 or 3 times in the American version. And that music was it left such a strong impression on me. It was
same here.
It was so visceral. It cut me to my musical core. So whenever I thought of King Kong vs. Godzilla, for me, the musical identity of King Kong vs. Godzilla was the Faroe Island chant, which so happens to have also been the main title for the film, so go figure.
Yeah.
That's why in my childhood self, I always thought that King Kong's leitmotif is the Faroe Island chant. So yeah, it just goes to show that Ifukube definitely has the stronger musical sensibility because he actually wrote music to fit the movie. So instead of just taking other composers' work from a decade or so ago, and that's something else, real quick. A lot of this music actually already sounds really old and poorly recorded. King Kong vs. Godzilla was released in the States in 1963, not even a full year after the Japanese release of the film in 1962. And yet the stock music that they put in there sounds really tinny. It sounds very, very low quality, which I want to make a note to, that the music we're going to be playing for you, dear listeners, is not of the greatest quality. You heard some fantastic stereophonic sounds in the previous episode with Ifukube's score from a wonderful CD presentation in stereo. You won't get this here. The quality of the music you are going to hear is going to jump all over the place. It's going to range from moderately decent to barely listenable. And we apologize sincerely for that. But the reason for that is we simply were not able to track down, despite our best efforts, any better quality versions of these particular cues. And secondly, the cues really were not in good condition to begin with. They really did not sound great. So please bear with us. The quality is all over the place. The style of music and the genres of music that you're going to hear is all over the place, from westerns to horrors to monster films. So it's truly a hodgepodge.
Yeah. Well, it is a
of
melting
experience.
pot. It's a mixed bag.
It is, just like the rest of the
movies.
film.
So what do you expect?
So yeah, that's all I got to say.
So now that we've discussed the background of this film, what happened with John Beck, Willis O'Brian, the changes done to this film, and the alterations, especially including the score itself, we'll just stop talking and we'll let you hear the score for yourself, see what you think about it, and hopefully it will either take you down a memory lane of nostalgia or just a enraging fury that it's not a Fuqua score.
So as you listen to this, you're going to be able to hear what Hollywood 60 years ago thought a Western score sounds like. And to be fair, there is a distinct demarcation between a lot of Japanese composer styles, in particular Ifukube's, and your run-of-the-mill Hollywood composer. And that's true whether you're talking about composers from the 1950s or composers from the 2020s. Even though composers today like Hans Zimmer write very different music than, say, Hans Salter was writing back in the 50s. Hollywood has always had a style of sound that has been markedly different than many Asian composers, which is, to be fair, there's a lot of cultural differences and influences involved there. So give this a listen. You heard the Japanese version. You've heard what Ifukube brought to the table. So even though none of this music was written for the film, it was what Hollywood thought American audiences wanted to hear. They didn't think that American audiences would have appreciated hearing the overtly Asian sounds of Ifukube. So do you agree? Do you think that an American-style score suits better for a Clash of the Titans movie like King Kong vs. Godzilla? Or do you think it's absolute heresy and the American producers should have been burned at the stake? I mean, that I'm not going to, try and sway you one way or the other. It's all a matter of, personal taste, really. So, yeah, consider this like a personal experiment.
Yeah, we won't judge you too harshly.
No, but, hey, leave your comments below and let us know what you think. Do you prefer the American score? What do you like about it? Is it nostalgic for you? Did you grow up with it like we did? So, oh my gosh, Jonathan, just think. Ever since Criterion Collection recently released the entire Showa collection, including in the bonus disc, the original theatrical version of King Kong vs. Godzilla with its original soundtrack intact, there is now an entire generation of children that could potentially be growing up watching the Japanese version of this film and never knowing the American cut, never knowing the stock music. We could be a dying generation. Wow.
Well, I will say I enjoyed even though it's a mixed bag, I still do enjoy the American version just with that nostalgia. But at least the children of this generation will be blessed by hearing Akira Fukube's original score. So
That's true. I guess they can consider themselves fortunate, but I wouldn't trade my childhood for anything.
oh no, I wouldn't want to be part of this generation. You kidding?
Oh, bloody kids. Stinking young whippersnappers. All right.
Yeah, who needs them?
So, enjoy, Internet. The American suite for King Kong vs. Godzilla by more composers than I can shake a stick at.
Hope you guys enjoy.
So how was your nostalgia trip, Jonathan?
I will say it was quite a journey. Even as I listened to the entire soundtrack, I just had each scene playing in my head because it is just so deeply ingrained at that point
Yes,
because that
yes.
is the version that I grew up with. That was the version that I've seen for so many years. And I could just paint every scene that was happening next and next. You'll be killed. You'll be killed.
Come back, you fool!
Or this isn't a zoo. So all those scenes were just playing as I was listening to the soundtrack. And honestly, yes, it might not compare personally, in my opinion, to Ifukube's more serious and more ominous score. However, it was a wonderful trip down nostalgia lane, regardless how anyone feels about it. It really does tug on the heartstrings a bit. And I do think it is fitting for what cues they decided to choose for this film in particular. How did you feel about it, Evan?
Well, yeah, on a nostalgic level, it is a pleasure to hear this score because it makes the 4-year-old inside of me giggle with joy. And just like you, the music immediately brings back images to my head as vividly as John Williams' score to Star Wars. It's like you play any cue from his Star Wars movies, I can tell you exactly what scene it's from, and I've got the image, I've got the lines in my head. I know how I felt when I first watched it. Same with this, because I watched this VHS to death. Um, on a more objective note, it's a mess. The style of genres are all over the place. The Western elements are really kind of silly, and it's not much of a good fit. The audio quality is embarrassing, and sometimes it's edited together in ways that are so abrupt. It as a standalone experience, it's rather jarring. So it's not great. I would give it a very poor rating based on itself, um, but because I look at it through rose-colored glasses, I have to give it a pass. So it is what it is. But I will absolutely take Ifukube's score over this any day. Of all the Godzilla scores that he did, I find myself listening to his score for King Kong versus Godzilla more frequently than most of them because it's just such an enjoyable soundtrack.
Right. And on top of that, many of the scores were not reused in many movies either, so it's very distinct. It has its own personal identity or mark
Yeah,
within the
in
Godzilla
retrospect,
franchise.
it retains its freshness. Yeah, that's very
Right.
true.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, if you want to get
So,
technical, each score was fresh when it first came out, but the more and more times you hear the same themes over and over again, the more and more the next movie starts sounding more like the previous movie.
right, exactly. So, with the ending of this film, you can hear the theme of The Empty House from Wichita Town, the end title, or from The Creature from the Black Lagoon, both scored by Salter. And it ends on a somewhat mysterious note at first, and at the end, you see Kong rise from the water and swim away back to Faroe Island. And it's accompanied by a final hurrah as the winner, quote unquote winner, is returning back home.
And
Though,
he triumphantly roars as the end appears on the screen. All right, first off, let me get a myth out of the way here. It has been printed and reprinted countless times for decades and decades and decades that there were two endings filmed for this movie. One for the Japanese audience, one for the American audience. In Japan, Godzilla wins against King Kong, and in America, King Kong wins against Godzilla. I am here to tell you that there is no such alternate ending. King Kong comes out victorious at the end of both movies. The only difference, as Jonathan mentioned, is in the Japanese version, you hear Godzilla's roar along with King Kong's roar, as if to say, don't worry, your favorite monsters will be back again. But King Kong is presented as the victor. And the reason is because, as in the previous movies and in the next one, Godzilla is portrayed as the antagonist. Yeah, Kong is not a hero by any means. He's causing destruction. He's angry. He was drugged and kidnapped and made to run amok, and now he's getting his fur singed by a flamethrower. But he is the lesser of two evils here. He is not radioactive. He's not a fire-breathing dragon. He doesn't live in Japan and constantly ravage it. He just wants to get back home, and we are made to root for King Kong because between the two of them, he's the good guy and Godzilla's the bad guy, so King Kong wins. However,
Right. And
Tomiyuki Tanaka tried to redact that much later, I think, in particular in the 80s or 90s. Tanaka tried to retcon it by saying, well, in fact, King Kong didn't actually win. It was a draw at the end of the movie. Well, and Tanaka put that in some kind of an official Godzilla book, so I'll let you be the decider, but originally King Kong is meant to be the victor because he's seen going off into the distance. However, I've got an argument. So we see King Kong swimming off to the distance. We hear his roar at the end of the movie. It's presented as if he won, and he is triumphantly swimming back to Faroe Island. However, let us not forget that of these two monsters, one of them breathes underwater and lives in the ocean, and the other is King Kong. So you could argue that King Kong pummeled Godzilla unconscious and is swimming off victorious, or you could interpret it as King Kong beating a hasty retreat because he's about to drown. But then again, you could argue that maybe King Kong really did get the upper hand. And the reason is because by this movie's logic, King Kong is powered by electricity. And during the final battle, he is struck by lightning, he's given electrical powers, and he uses pseudo-force lightning on Godzilla.
Deus Ex Machina.
So, yeah, right? And so you could argue, well, if they're in the ocean and water conducts electricity, Kong's electrical powers are probably zapping Godzilla that much more so. And so Godzilla swam away or couldn't take the heat or was rendered unconscious or whatever. Yeah, you could argue that. And I guess it kind of technically makes sense. Though to be fair, during like the last 3 minutes of the battle, Kong was not shown using his electrical abilities at all. It gave the impression that it eventually wore off and that both monsters were kind of on even footing at the end. So I'm fine with accepting that King Kong wins this battle. Godzilla won the first one, King Kong won the second one. It's 1-1. You know, if they were to go to the death, we all know Godzilla would win.
Oh, absolutely.
Because
there's no doubt.
Yeah, right.
I don't think anyone could argue that. I mean, they even call him a flamethrower, so...
Yeah.
So
I mean, well, let's think about it. Godzilla's bigger, he's stronger, he's radioactive, he's got regenerative abilities, and he breathes fire. I mean,
yeah.
And Kong is like what? He can use tools, and he's got agility. Whoop-de-doo. All Godzilla needs to do is hit him once with his atomic breath, and he's dead. Take note, Legendary Pictures, for your upcoming 2021 Godzilla vs. Kong movie. If Godzilla does not win this battle, there will be
blood.
There will be blood.
We will come with torches.
All right. Anyways, though, but that's that. Jonathan, I have a sad thing to share with you, though.
Oh dear! It ended on a sour note.
I'm afraid so. This is rather bittersweet. I mentioned earlier that Willis O'Brian had the project, his passion project of King Kong versus Frankenstein, stolen from him essentially by John Beck. And O'Brian, who the entire time King Kong versus Godzilla is going on, was thinking that John Beck was still shopping the thing around for his future project, which he would do the stop motion animation for. He did not find out about King Kong versus Godzilla until months after that movie came out in Japan. And when he found out, he was livid. He accused John Beck of being a thief, a crook. He actually tried to file a lawsuit, but to my understanding, he wasn't able to go through with it because he didn't have the finances for a long-term lawsuit. He didn't have much finances at all, which is why he was shopping around passion projects. Some rumors say that he tried to sue RKO and Universal and Toho and John Beck and everyone and their grandmother.
You were just suing everyone left and right.
There isn't any confirmation of that. Only that he tried to pursue a lawsuit with John Beck, but it didn't go anywhere. Willis O'Brian was working on a brief special effects sequence for the 1963 movie It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. And he passed away in 1962 after King Kong vs. Godzilla was released in Japan, but before it was released in the United States. But even Willis O'Brien's wife, Darlene, admitted in an interview, quote,
I am positive the tension of being out of work during the last 2 years and the frustration of the King Kong versus Frankenstein deal had a lot to do with the heart attack that took Obi's life.
So let's just stop and think about this for a moment. On one hand, one of the most beloved and seminal features in the entire Godzilla franchise. In fact, the very film that created the Godzilla franchise is partly responsible for the death of King Kong's creator, because he couldn't handle the stress, he couldn't handle the anxiety, and that was just one of the many straws that eventually broke the camel's back. On the other hand, if O'Brian hadn't been swindled out of his passion project and his beloved baby of King Kong taken from his hands and given to the Japanese, we would never have had a Godzilla series, probably. We would not, 66 years later and 35 movies later, be talking about Godzilla if we didn't get King Kong versus Godzilla as we got it. So, you have people talk about, like, if you could go back in time and stop Hitler from causing World War II, would you do it by killing baby Hitler? It's like, well, killing baby Hitler would stop World War II, but you'd also be killing an innocent infant. So it's like, would you rather, O'Brian have gotten his passion project done and have died a satisfied old man, and then probably have never gotten the Godzilla franchise? Or would you rather things have gone the way they actually did? I'm not asking anyone to make that choice. I'm giving you food for thought.
Right. It's a hard scenario because on one hand, yes, we were able to enjoy this film and even reminisce about it and just go through all these memories. At the same time, it is rather sad it had to go this way for King Kong versus Godzilla to even become a thing. And it's even sad to know that he just spent a lot of his time just trying to sell off all these ideas, and he was constantly rejected. And as we mentioned before, the film The Valley of Gwangi was pretty much the last incarnation of one of his ideas that he had, and that was made in 1969. So it's a mixed bag of feelings, honestly, in this kind of scenario, because obviously you don't want anyone to go through what he went through, and at the same time, it's a conflict of interest here. I am very happy that on one hand I've been able to enjoy this film for so long. It is just unfortunate that someone as iconic and who has someone who's made such an impact like Willis O'Brian had to go through something like that. So take it for what you will. It's unfortunate that it had to go this way, but in a more positive note, we are talking about him now and realizing that if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have this movie. So I think you can at least think it like that.
I think that film historian Steve Reifel said it beautifully in his book Japan's Favorite Monstar, which, by the way, we take a lot of our resources from. So thank you, Mr. Reifel. You're a godsend. And he said, I quote, "The final product," talking about King Kong versus Godzilla, "notwithstanding, the story of how O'Brian's last filmic ideas evolved into this picture is tragic, and shows how readily the cigar-smoking Hollywood deal-makers of the 1950s and 60s would disregard the hopes and dreams of a great filmmaker to make a buck for themselves." So, in short, you can't blame Toho for killing Willis O'Brian. That's not what we're trying to say here. That's unrealistic. It's not fair. It's not true. Toho didn't even know anything about the O'Brian aspect of this. All they saw was an American coming to their studio with the license for King Kong. What it bespeaks to is the dog-eat-dog world of the Hollywood studio system, especially back in the day. And how Hollywood, though many of the movies that it has churned out have been incredible classics and works of art, at the end of the day, it's a business. And what they're more concerned about turning a profit in the short term than creating works of art that will last for centuries. From that perspective, O'Brian was an unfortunate victim of the studio system and of the world that we live in, of the greed of the film industry. Toho had nothing to do with that. Toho was not evil. Toho was not
No.
what's the word I'm looking for? Malevolent. They simply wanted to make a movie. They were given an opportunity and they jumped on it. So it was an unfortunate circumstance. It's very, very bittersweet from that perspective, but it's, in a weird twist of fate, it gave me an awesome childhood.
It did. And we're even discussing about him right now and how much of a contribution he, in a sense, indirectly created for this film, even though he wasn't really credited for anything. So there is that. But overall, with this movie, the score, and altogether, it is a true nostalgia trip. Yes, it has its faults, for sure. It doesn't live up, at least in my opinion, to the original Japanese version. However, it will always have a special place for me, just with everything that was done with it and how much of an impact it created on me. So, and I mean, we're talking about the two biggest kaiju, or just monsters in general, of all time. And it's so popular, we're even getting another version of it, like you mentioned, eventually, whenever that comes out. But it really speaks on the impact that it made in the film franchise and how kaiju battles were going to be a popular thing from here on out. So in many regards, I am thankful for this film, both the Japanese and American, because they did create an impact in a different way.
So thanks, everyone, for joining us for part 2 of episode 3. Next week, we're going to go into episode 4, Mothra vs. Godzilla, one of Ifukube's best and most memorable scores and a personal favorite of mine. So till then,
I'm Jonathan.
I'm Evan.
And this has been G-Score the podcast. And remember, kids, if your corns hurt, I'm not saying it's monsters, but it's monsters.